one and all who have joined us today. On behalf of Campus Law Center and Debate and Discussion Society, I welcome you all to today's online session. I'm 𝗗𝗲𝗯𝘁𝗲, a final year student at Campus Law Center and currently heading the Debate Society, along with a fellow batchmate of mine, Mr. Vijay Pujari. Today's online session is a much awaited one as Mr. Sai Deepak is joining us on the platform of Debate and Discussion Society after 2 whole years. Sir, in 2019, addressed us in an overcrowded seminar hall of Campus Law Center on the topic Article 370, when Vijay and I were just starting our tenure as conveners of the society. And now that we are nearing to the end of our tenure, we are grateful to Mr. Sai Deepak to have joined us today. We have surely come a full circle. We thank you, sir, on behalf of our college and our society for being ever so gracious and granting us with your precious time. We would also like to congratulate sir for an overwhelming and unprecedented response on his book, India That is Bharat, published by Bloomsbury. The book is the first one of the comprehensive trilogy which explores the influence of European colonial consciousness, that is coloniality, on the Bharat as the successor state to Indic civilization and the origins of Indian constitution. Now, I would like to request our arena of knowledge and our professor in charge, Professor Raman Mittal, to kindly welcome our guest and to address us with his welcome remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, 𝗗𝗲𝗯𝘁𝗲. So we are extremely delighted that the Debate and Discussion Society of Campus Law Center has taken this wonderful initiative to organize a webinar by inviting Shri J. Sai Deepak, a noted lawyer. And it is my proud privilege to welcome you, sir. Indeed, the topic of the discussion, India That is Bharat, Coloniality, Civilization, Constitution, is inaugurating and provoking. My dear friends, the Olympic Games have just concluded. And for the first time, we have, as a nation, were able to win a gold medal, the first one for India in track and field. Winning medals in the greatest human sporting competition is no joke. Medals cannot be won by fluke as well. It requires years of training by the individual and support system by family, society, country. Everything plays its own role. Let us now look at Japan, the country that hosted the recently concluding Olympics. Not only has Japan successfully hosted the Olympics, it has been able to win 58 medals with 27 gold, ranking third in the whole world. Quite a feat for a country that is quite small in terms of landmass, which is continuously marred by natural challenges like earthquakes and tsunamis. Let us peep into the recent history of Japan for a moment. We all know that Japan was defeated by the forces led by America in the Second World War. Japan was destroyed and was occupied by the American military forces in April 1945. American General Douglas MacArthur was appointed the Supreme Commander in Japan, where he lived for about 6 years until 1951. A new constitution was drawn up under his guidance and with his approval, and the same was ratified by the Japanese Assembly on November 3, 1946. Well, the Japanese people had no freedom to draw their own constitution. The new constitution reduced the status of the Emperor of Japan to that of a mere symbolic head of the state. And under Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, the Japanese nation was also made to pledge that all land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The Constitution apparently sounded the death knell of Japan as a nation. As vanquished, the Japanese leaders had little choice. So they quickly debated amongst themselves and accepted the Constitution. The instrument that closed all doors for Japan to grow into a proud nation again, well, almost. The Japanese leaders saw that although the Constitution closed all doors for Japan from military and political point of view, the door to industrial and scientific advance was still wide open. Heeding to the constitutional sanction, the Japanese quickly withdrew from the field of military and political confrontation, but vigorously began to exploit the remaining opportunities the the few remaining opportunities in the fields of science and industry and business. Just 40 years later, historians were compelled to write these words for Japan. They said, defeated in World War II, Japan emerged from the ruins of war as one of the major economic powers in the world. Friends, we have had a long colonial past. By a strange incident, we had a chance to live with or under the suzerainty of the United Kingdom as one of our colonies. Today, when we look around, we find that our social and political life has been stamped by the British influence, which is rather all too pervasive. The language, education, railway, telegraph, our laws, the system of governance, the military organization are just a few spheres where British influence is perceptible rather easily and directly, even after so many years of our independence. But in this process, we must stop and ponder, was there nothing that we had devised for ourselves before the invaders and the traders came and occupied our subcontinent? Turning back to Japan, from where I had begun, I had a chance to visit Japan a few years back to participate in a seminar. I did not have much time there, but still enough to explore their national museum. When I entered the National Museum of Japan in Tokyo, I was shocked. I was stunned. It felt like I have come to a place in India. The only difference being that it was so spick and span that a single particle of dust was imperceptible. All around, whether in paintings, in sculpture, or inscription, dating back 1,500 years or more, there was depictions of Buddhist stories and also from Indian culture, from epics like Raman, Mahabharata, from Upanishads, Puranas, etc. Well, Buddhist stories I could have expected, but stories from epics, depictions of Indian gods, demigods, and demons was beyond my imagination. On inquiry, I was told that when the Buddhist monks were invited to visit Japan way back, more than 1,000 years back, from India, they took the stories, the folklore that was prevalent in India at that time, and the Japanese have preserved and valued all that with great respect until today. Friends, it's very important to learn from others if we wish to grow. So we as a nation must welcome all that is good and positive from other countries, from other cultures, from around the world. If the British built up roads and rails, we need not pick them up just because they are reminiscent of our colonial past. But at the same time, we must also not forget and forsake what has been our culture, our own culture from the distant past. Must we not cherish our own contribution to the world thought, something that others have valued and we tend to forget and undermine? In order to address the conflict between the memory of Bharat and the dream of India, we have invited Shri J. Sai Deepak, who is not only a young and dynamic lawyer, but a person who I personally see as a leader of the future. Thank you very much, sir, for agreeing to our request to speak to our students and faculty members. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, sir, for your welcome remarks. Now, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our guest, Mr. J. Sai Deepak. Mr. Sai Deepak is practicing as an arguing counsel in Supreme Court of India and Delhi High Court. His areas of practice are civil and commercial litigation, intellectual property law, constitutional law, and competition law. Although Sir has to his name a plethora of cases, but to name a few, State of MP Basmati GI case, Tata Sons versus Greenpeace, Shreya Singhal versus Union of India, and Ericsson versus Competition Commission of India, where the Delhi High Court upheld the jurisdiction of CCI in matters of intellectual property. On this note, we again extend a warm welcome to Mr. Sai Deepak, who will be addressing us on the topic and book India That is Bharat, Coloniality, Civilization, and Constitution. Without much further ado, I yield the floor to Mr. Sai Deepak himself. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much for giving me this platform. Let me start with one correction, a minor correction, perhaps an important correction to what Mittalji said. I would request him to address me as Saiji and not sir. He is way senior to me. And I've had the pleasure of sharing space with him in quite a few interviews. I've always enjoyed his company. And to know that I have the confidence and, dare I say, even the affection of such people matters a lot to me. And I'm grateful to the student organizers, especially Vijay, because he reminds me of the Betal from Vikram Betal. Okay, because he's persistent and he gets what he wants under any circumstances, which I think is important for anyone who wishes to practice in Delhi. So I think he's got all the attributes of a successful practitioner in Delhi, which is persistence. So thanks to Vijay, because he's been trying to organize this for quite some time, and the entire student team. While there's a vote of thanks that's usually reserved at the end of, let's say, an interaction, I prefer to start with it, because I hope my memory doesn't fail me at the end of the interaction. So I'm grateful to all the student organizers, and I'm happy to interact with you on this book. I don't wish to make this a self-edificatory session on the book, so I'll try to keep this as specific as possible. And whatever questions that you may have, even with respect to practice or the realities of the profession, you're welcome to ask me. So I think Ramanji has set the tone for the discussion and has more or less captured, according to me, the bhav or the spirit of my book and the intention behind the book or the writing of the book in the first place. It's interesting that Sir has actually cited an example from the East, because as Indians, we look for examples from the West. And it's fantastic that I think the book has managed to resonate with his thought process at this particular level, because Japan, or for that matter, quite a few nations of the East, maybe because they have been relatively untouched by the waves of colonialism and invasion that Bharat has been subjected to, perhaps stands out as an example of a nation or a society that is fairly at ease with its past and is comfortable living in a globalized, Europeanized world. And this is a balance that I think India has been struggling to strike ever since its independence. And that's one of the reasons that I felt that I must undertake this particular initiative. Not the savior complex, because there are better educated people and experts who are capable of holding forth on this topic better than I will ever be capable of. But in my own limited way, given that I have a serious interest in this document called the Constitution, and since the Constitution has such a huge bearing on what we know of Bharat and what we think of India, and this dual personality that has affected our consciousness as to whether we are Indians or Bharatiyas, I wanted to address this. The standard way of addressing any subject relating to the Constitution or any discussion relating to the Constitution is to go to the Constant Assembly debates, which I felt was a done-to-death way of looking at it, and it was a cliched way of looking at it. So the idea was to go much beyond that and ask if there is a conceptual framework on the basis of which I could look at this entire creature called constitutionalism or contemporary constitutionalism and understand what are its politico-theological origins, what are its religious origins, what are its racial origins, because there are discussions on this particular aspect as well. So that, coupled with my own first-hand experience of having given the opportunity to participate in matters of civilizational importance or constitutional matters of civilizational importance, I felt I had some ammunition, some experience, and a fair bit of standing to comment on these issues. There's a decent chance that perhaps I could have written this issue half a decade ago, but I wouldn't have had the experience that I have today. And most importantly, today, I think I mean, given where I am in my life now, thanks to my age or no thanks to my age, there is a fair combination of experience and energy that gives me the drive to write a book of this particular nature. Because you see, I don't think lawyers are particularly trained or good at writing on humanities as such beyond the realm of the law, because I don't think we have the training for it. At least the curricula doesn't give us that kind of training. I wish our education system, at least the legal education system, equipped us better in the realm of economics, in the realm of history, in the realm of political economy, in the realm of philosophy, particularly Indian philosophy, which I don't think figures even remotely as far as our legal education system is concerned. So these are aspects that I wanted to address, but as opposed to addressing the symptoms or the external effects, I wanted to address the meta issue, the subliminal issue, which is perhaps the cause underlying the cause, as I call it in the book, which is to say it's a question of consciousness, it's a question of mansikta. And unless and until that aspect is addressed, unless the software is addressed, it's difficult to address the hardware, because the hardware, so to speak, or the infrastructure, so to speak, is a manifestation of thought. And therefore, it's important to address those filters which plague our thought process and which prevent us from accessing a past of our history and heritage. That's the spirit behind this particular book. So without revealing too much, until students have an opportunity to read the book, let me try and give you a flavor of the overall structure of the book, because I don't want you to be bogged down by the volume of the book. It's about 484 pages and inclusive of, let's say, index and everything, but the content alone runs into about 440, 450 pages. It's close to about 1,35,000, 1,40,000 words. But the last 4 chapters are relatively easier to read for the simple reason that they heavily cite the British parliamentary debates as to what were they thinking about Bharat when they decided to set up the legal infrastructure in this country. And that, I think, would make extremely interesting reading for students. So without changing the sequence, let me start from the beginning, so to speak. The title, as I expect students to be aware of, is a direct lift from Article 1 of the Constitution. And since we keep referring to this country as India, I wanted to draw attention to the fact that no, it is actually India that is Bharat, and Bharat is the core of its identity and perhaps the soul of its identity. So that is an aspect that I wanted to draw attention to. And I've divided the book into 3 parts, which is captured in the subtitle, so to speak, of the book, which is Coloniality, Civilization, Constitution. Coloniality is the first section, which provides the broad, general, global canvas of the colonization of the world by European nations, and what was the thought process behind it, what were its direct impacts, and how was racism or ethnocentrism introduced as part of the thought process of colonized nations as a consequence of the colonizers' thought process. From there, I gradually moved to Bharat's tryst with European colonialism, and there is a very critical subsection where I also deal with pre-European colonization of Bharat by the Middle East or Middle Eastern consciousness, and where I explain why it is equally relevant, because I believe that Bharat's consciousness is buried under 2 layers of external consciousness. One is European, which most of us are comfortable speaking about, and the second is Middle Eastern. So I've discussed that in as clear a fashion as possible. I have compared and contrasted both these colonialities in terms of what brings them together and what separates them or what distinguishes them. So that's a significant aspect of the book that I wish students pay attention to. The third section of the book is the Constitution, where I basically ask myself this question, that if colonial consciousness or European colonial consciousness has infected every part of Bharat's society, from culture to language to its versions of history to our understanding of religion, caste, and whatnot, is it possible to conclude that the Constitution is somehow independent of colonial consciousness? So, because you see, the Constitution is the product of political economy and the society. So if you believe that the entire society is buried under several layers of colonial consciousness, is it possible to assume that a document such as the Constitution that emanates from that very society is free from colonial consciousness? That is the question that I have asked. An important clarification here is warranted. The first book, so this book is book 1 of the Bharat trilogy, because initially I wanted to write 1 book, but as the research went along and we stumbled upon such mountain of, let's say, fantastic literature, I decided to do justice to the literature by splitting the book into 3 and converting this into a trilogy as opposed to a single book. So I have broken up the timelines and split up the timelines as follows. This book effectively covers the period from 1492, which marks the year of Columbus's expedition, which is the beginning of European colonization of the world, until 1919-1920. That period is relevant because the First World War ends. The Paris Peace Conference is where they have discussions on the conclusion of the war. It results in the Treaty of Versailles, which ultimately also leads to gradually the founding of the League of Nations in 1920. how each of these international developments have a bearing on constitutional reshaping of colonized nations, including Bharat, is a specific discussion I undertake. Because whenever we discuss constitution, we think of it as a municipal document or a local document or a domestic document. But constitutionalism, as we understand it today, is effectively a product of international law, because the Middle Kingdom or the Chinese Empire ultimately had to become the Republic of China. The Kingdom of Siam had to become Thailand. The Japanese Empire had to become a Republic of Japan. Everybody had to imbibe a constitution. Similarly, Bharat had to follow suit. So therefore, I place Bharat's movement towards the constitution or towards the concept of constitutionalism within the broader global canvas of international law. I also explain whether international law is truly international or is it Western law which is being imposed and superimposed as international law. So I discuss several aspects of international law as part of the first chapter as well as the first section as well as the third section. The third section of the book ultimately discusses the period between I'd say 1853 to 1919. So the last four chapters, that is chapter 8 and 9, form part of section 2 of the book, and the third section of the book has only two chapters, chapters 10 and 11. So chapters 8, 9, 10 and 11 are critical, and I'm sure law students will certainly enjoy those sections because I have captured the period starting from the 31st of December 1600 until 1920. And 31st of December 1600 is the date on which charter was issued to what we know as the London Company, which is the English East India Company. And from the entry of the company into Bharat until the promulgation of the Government of India Act of 1919, which Dr. Ambedkar referred to as the first British-made constitution for Bharat, that is the journey that I traverse. So I look at the preparatory documents that led to the formation of the Government of India Act, and the book ends at 1920. The next book will start from 1920 and end at 1951 because it covers three important milestones, major milestones. The Government of India Act of 1935, the Government of India Act of, let's say, the Indian Independence Act of 1947, followed by the Constitution's framing itself. And then, of course, the first amendment to the Constitution that was undertaken in 1951, which resulted in truncation of free speech, inclusion of the ninth schedule and land reform, so on and so forth. The third sequel, or rather the second sequel and the third book of the trilogy, will cover the period from 1952. That is, the first general elections happened in 1952, and at least until 1976-77, which is Indira Gandhi's regime, where several monumental, tectonic, and I'm not sure whether they are positive, constitutional amendments were undertaken. At least until 1977 will be covered. The tentative period is only until 1977, but I hope to go well beyond that and even cover the period until 1990s, 2000s. So that's a function of my time and my own schedule. But this is the split that I've undertaken. Students, law students or non-law students who prepare for civil services will find this particularly useful, this book, simply because what they think of Indian bureaucracy, what they understand of Indian administrative structures, I've tried to bust quite a few myths as part of this particular book. So this is more or less the summary of the book. So as opposed to revealing further, I'd like to take questions and then see how the conversation goes.
So thank you for broadly laying out a framework of the book. It was great, and thank you so much for accepting my invite, and grateful, sir. So my first question to you would be, what is in it for the law students? You were speaking about it's relevant for law students. And right. What is in it for the law students? And does it add any practical value to the law students and aspiring lawyers as well?
So let me answer the second question first. What is the practical value of understanding the Constitution if you're interested in getting into civil commercial litigation? Right? For any law student, what is the point of reading a Constitution? There are two aspects. One is, if you're interested in a practice of constitutional law, then obviously this is a book that I would strongly suggest you read. Not because I've written it, but because it at least gives you a slightly different perspective from the commentaries that you come across. See, one of the things that a publisher asks you before accepting your book proposal is book mein aisa kya hai jo kisi aur book mein nahi hai, isko kyun chhape? That will be the first question that the publisher asks. I can confidently say that there's not a single book in the market, in the Indian market at least, that brings together coloniality, constitution and civilization together in a single book and connects all these dots. So I'm sure people can have their own criticisms of the book, but I'm confident of this particular product, at least in this respect, that there's not a single book that weaves and stitches together each of these thought processes. So, as opposed to the traditional understanding of the constitution that you get based on simply किसने frame किया, किसने draft किया, Constituent Assembly में क्या discuss हुआ, it will go much beyond that. And your understanding of the concept and the document called the Constitution will have a greater global perspective to it, as opposed to having a very narrow, limited perspective. So it will go much beyond Bharat. It will have to think of what is the meaning of constitutionalism on the global stage. That is something that you'll try and understand. Now, why should students read it? What is the practical value? Well, every constitutional discussion ultimately has a bearing on your life, whether it's Article 370, CAA, or judgments of the Supreme Court, such as the Ram Janmabhoomi judgment. We seem to constantly revolve around the constitution because that has effectively become the battleground of ideologies. That has effectively become the battleground of worldviews. Whether you call yourself a leftist or a rightist or a center-right or a center-left or whatever label you choose to attribute to yourself, you are effectively going to try and impose those ideologies and those positions on the constitution. Therefore, this book, according to me, certainly satisfies what I would call perhaps a metaphysical need as opposed to a practical need. Okay, because today all of us seem to swear by this book as if it is the Gita or the Bible or the Quran, as if this is a religious document. Whether this document should be treated as a sacred document as opposed to being seen as a practical document is the question that I try and unpack as part of this particular book. Because the sense of religiosity with which we now address this particular book, and we have created bizarre creatures called constitutional patriots, which according to me has no value or no relevance at all, and is meaningless, and it's a farce according to me. These are aspects that I've tried to address in the book, saying, what are you really swearing by? Do you know what you're talking about as far as the Constitution is concerned? What do you mean by constitutional patriotism? A document that has undergone 104 amendments, you're telling me is supposed to be a sacred document, and that's the book that you swear by as opposed to the civilization that is supposed to be the object of protection. These are the kind of issues that I've addressed. In fact, perhaps this book is better heard through an audible, because I hope to release an audio version of this so that my entire, let's say, my style of speaking comes out through the book itself. So hopefully that should be in the works in some time. But nevertheless, what I've tried to do is that every such discussion usually turns into a passionate discussion as opposed to a scholarly intellectual discussion. Okay, so I've tried to address this citing literature, citing conceptual frameworks, citing history, citing global examples to say, if all of this has happened in the rest of the world, why do you believe that when this colonizer entered this country, his only interest was trade and not religion? Okay, so I've basically said, stop looking at the past through a secular lens, because the past has never operated in the secular lens. There were very clear motives, both religious and racial, and the more you try to run away from these aspects, the more they will come back and bite you. Therefore, it's important to square up to the past with a certain degree of honesty and candor, as opposed to being yellow-bellied people who have no stomach for history or facts or, let's say, reality. So I've tried to understand that, and I have tried to explain the contemporary relevance of the past to say the very challenges that you faced, let's say, 200 or 300 years ago, they have now been presented to you in a slightly different fashion, but the nature of the arguments and the nature of the problem or the nature of the tussle has not changed. The framework may have changed, the language may have changed, but the goals remain the same. Therefore, it's extremely important to understand the context, the global context of the, let's say, the local battles or the local ideological tussles that we see on a daily basis. So therefore, from that perspective, this is important. Why should a law student otherwise read it? Well, simply because I think you'll come out better informed and perhaps more rounded, because whatever is it that I have had to learn during the process of the writing of this book, I wish I had been taught in law school, which is to say that we have typically understood law primarily through the prism of law as opposed to understanding it through the prism of culture and society. So the idea is to go back to the basics and say, please reformulate the way you look at law and do not divorce it from context, and do not divorce it from history, do not divorce it from circumstance, and do not divorce it from what in Hindi would translate to Prishtabhumi and Sandarbh. Okay, so it's important to understand the context of a certain document. So that's what I try to do through this book. So to me, I think it's a book that I would have bought if someone had written, and it's unfortunate that I didn't have such a book to read. simply because I think my learning curve would have been cut short significantly and I'd have understood better. So it's unfortunate that such a book is being written after several years, simply because such literature already exists outside this country. I'm not doing something that is pioneering or new. What I'm doing is that the literature that exists outside and that has been produced by Indian scholars outside is not widely known in Bharat. I'm bringing that to Bharat's audience, and I'm specifically applying that in the context of the Constitution. So if someone were to ask me, what is your contribution, what is your USP? Well, I have two primary contributions as far as the book is concerned. I have brought together three concepts in a single book, and I have specifically applied a conceptual framework in the realm of the Constitution so that we can look at this document in a slightly different fashion. So those are my reasons.
Okay, sir. So you talked about building a bridge, contextual bridge between law and history. Do you think the book does it successfully?
I think history buffs will certainly find the book interesting because close to 75 to 80% of the book is history. In fact, I would say only 30% of the audience that I am interested in are lawyers. 70% are non-lawyers and students of history and civilization. There are aspects, so even where I've tried to address law, I've addressed it through the perspective of history, where I'm connecting historical, let's say, milestones to developments in law. So why should the First World War be understood in the context of Bharat's first constitution, which is the Government of India Act of 1919? Why should, let's say, the ban on sati, which was undertaken in Bengal, be connected to the presence of the bishop in Calcutta and the seat of power in the Calcutta presidency or the Bengal presidency? Then why should, let's say, social reform suddenly start in the very place where, let's say, the British seat of power was located, which is Bengal, and where the archbishop was actually sitting? So why is the concept of reform coinciding with the presence of the bishop? Okay, these are aspects that I've tried to address. I've also addressed significant aspects of the colonial experience of the Americas and the Africa and the African continent, to basically ask if this has been his treatment of other races and other societies, the European treatment of other communities, why do you think he would have treated us any differently? Surely it can't be your case that Bharat ke andar aate hi inka ye matlab hriday parivartan ho gaya. Okay, aisa thodi ho sakta hai. Because it is a punya bhumi for us, not for them. So it's not as if they had a change of heart the moment they stepped into the sacred soil, right? So surely they would have tried to undertake the very same social experiments that they undertook in North America, in Latin America, and in Africa. So if we have managed to survive those experiments despite those experiments, why are we giving credit to the colonizer as opposed to our own culture and as opposed to our inherent strength? So I've asked the question, one man chooses to fight 10 people, 9 people are either killed or converted, the 10th man survives, and we are being told that we should be grateful to the one person who has killed 9 people as opposed to the 10th man who stood up to fight back. Okay, so according to me, if I were to put it in cricket terms, under Steve Waugh, you effectively had a, let's say, a world-winning team, but the juggernaut was stopped when they entered Bharat. Okay, especially in Eden Garden in Calcutta, fittingly, so to speak. Okay, so in historical terms, Bharat is the place where the European juggernaut was halted, where the European juggernaut of colonialism effectively met its defeat, because it could not succeed the same way it succeeded in Australia, New Zealand, Africa, Haiti, Caribbean, everywhere. It failed here miserably. The fact that you continue to practice the way of life of your ancestors is proof of your success and his defeat. And that's what I've tried to say and convey through this book.
Can I ask a question, please?
GG, please, sir.
Okay, so Sai ji, I want to ask, my question is there a quarrel? Is there a quarrel between Bharat and India? A conflict between Bharat and India? Should we shun one and keep the other? Or can we synthesize the two?
So, Raman sir, actually, I have extracted debates on Article 1 as part of this book from the Constant Assembly to show कि किस तरह का चिंतन और मंथन चल रहा था. Okay, because it's a decolonial discussion, kindly allow me to switch to an Indian language often. Okay, so I have tried to show what kind of synthesis was sought to be arrived at, but retaining the clear identity that India is nothing without Bharat. And the core and the soul of this country is Bharat first and everything else. Okay. So that is something that I have tried to address. Unfortunately, over the last 70 years, India has become the dominant identity and Bharat has been relegated to the margins. And we have been trying to use the constitution to drive a wedge between India and Bharat. That is the unfortunate reality. Creatures and concepts such as constitutional patriotism and constitutional morality are being used to effectively drive a wedge and create infinite degrees of separation between India and Bharat. Okay, and to sever all possible connection between India and Bharat. So if I have to choose between India and Bharat, I would any day and always choose Bharat. But if I'm told that India will never let go of Bharat and will remain Bharat at its heart, then I'm happy with the synthesis. But if someone puts a gun to my head and says, choose between the two, my choice is very clear, Bharat and Bharat alone.
Thank you, sir. Sir, policy making, sir. You talked about policy making, and policy making is largely attributed to the European colonies, mainly the British. Have you addressed that particular issue? The system of India has its origin in Europe and Britain.
Right. So I have tried to address the administrative structure and the policy making infrastructure that was set up in Bharat, primarily through the perspective of what was the European thinking when he set up the process. Okay. So the nuts and bolts of the division between the center and the state legislature and the union legislature, the union list and the concurrent, let's say the state list and the concurrent list, those are external manifestations. And all of that can be traced to a single document, which was the Montfort Report of 1918, which was prepared by Montagu and, of course, Chelmsford, let's say the Viceroy and the Secretary of State for Bharat. Okay, so this Constitutional Reforms Report of 1918 is the basic document on the basis of which the 1919 Act, the Government of India Act, was promulgated. And the 1919 Act became the foundation for the 1935 Act. And I've also cited Constituent Assembly debates where Dr. Ambedkar admits that the Constitution is effectively a reproduction of the 1935 Act of the Government of India Act of 1935. So those are external manifestations. So saying that a parliament is set up, then you have certain representative institutions that are being set up. I've addressed those aspects in passing. But the main thing that I've explained is every institution has a thought process behind it. The assumption that we typically make when it comes to European institutions is that they were secular institutions. Whereas I'm saying, no, they were never secular institutions. They were institutions operating within a very specific politico-theological framework, which, dare I say, according to them, is Christian, Protestant, or Anglican Christian framework. They are very clear about this, which is precisely why, as opposed to allowing my own biases or my own prejudices to reflect in the book, I have heavily reproduced two important materials. First is the British parliamentary debates starting from at least 1813 until 1919. I covered it for over a century, heavily extracted. See, usually what happens is parliamentary debates or all of these aspects are annexed to the book or appended to the book as an appendix, and it's left to the fag end of the book. And nobody reads an appendix. Nobody ever reads an appendix. Okay. It's merely to protect your own self. When somebody asks, iska support kahan pe, then you say, yahan pe hai. But beyond that, nobody reads it. So what I've done is that I have reproduced it heavily, peppered it with my own commentary. Plus what I've done is that I have shown the specific provisions of each of the East India Company Acts, which were the products of these parliamentary debates, to show that the intention was reflected in the debate and the implementation of the intention was clearly reflected in the legislation itself, to show that he was very clear that the principle he was operating under was a Christian principle, and it translated to a Christian provision or a Christian legislation, not a secular legislation. So for instance, one of the prominent examples that I give is, I'm sure you've heard, the Bombay High Court was previously the Supreme Court judicature of the Bombay Presidency. So the first three presidency courts that were effectively set up were Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, which is why they are known as the senior courts in this country, because after that Allahabad and Delhi came subsequently in the 1960s. Okay. Now, the Bombay High Court was set up under the Indian Bishops and Courts Act of 1823. Okay. What was this Indian Bishops and Courts Act? He specifically creates a bishop for the Bombay presidency, because previously a bishop was appointed for Calcutta. Similarly, a bishop for Bombay presidency is created. And in the same legislation, the Supreme Court of Bombay is established. Can you call this a secular legislation? It's a mix of a secular and non-secular legislation. And importantly, the Christian establishment in this country was funded through the revenues raised in this country. The bishops were paid for, their expenses were completely paid for from the revenues earned in this country. So how on earth was this a secular establishment? This was a Christian establishment. So that I have shown through documents, specifically showing how funds were allocated through statutory provisions for the establishment of the Christian ecosystem in this country. I have captured it debate after debate after debate. From House of Lords to the House of Commons to discussions between the Viceroy and the Secretary of the State, everything is captured. So the idea is to basically show that we have not read enough, or we do not wish to, let's say, examine these aspects of the colonial establishment, because somehow this creature called secularism blinds us and prevents us from asking these uncomfortable questions. So I said, okay, I will not give an uncomfortable opinion. I will give you an uncomfortable fact. Let us see what you do with the fact. So what I've done is that I have thrown facts and material, and I've said, now you apply your own vivek, your own buddhi to come to the right conclusion. That's what I've done.
Sure, sir. So now that we have addressed the policy making, do you subscribe? My question is rather direct here. Do you subscribe to the same version of history that is expected to be subscribed by our civil servants and thereby the civil service aspirants?
100% not. In fact, I have dedicated certain portions of the book to explain how the popular opinion of, let's say, the bureaucracy in this country resonates with the British man's opinion when he established the bureaucracy in this country. Okay, I've given specific examples saying every time we speak of the British experience or the colonial experience, the standard response of certain civil aspirants and bureaucrats is, अगर अंग्रेज नहीं होते तो पोस्ट नहीं होता, टेलीग्राफ नहीं होता, railway lines नहीं होते. This is the line of inquiry that they come out with. Okay. Are you telling me that scientific development is the sole repository of any particular race or community? Are you telling me that the concept of science is completely unknown to this particular civilization, which had astronomy, which had mathematics? Is that your understanding of history? So I've said, don't look at this as, let's say, with this misty-eyed version of colonialism, where the British man came here to educate us and to teach us English. He came here to civilize us according to him, and because according to him we were barbarians and savages. Okay. So I have tried to show that the reason why colonial mentality still continues in the administrative infrastructure and setup of this country is primarily because civil service aspirants are expected to subscribe to colonial versions of Bharat's history. Everything, starting from economics to religion to caste. So I'm not surprised that the policy making constantly focuses on reforming people. It's almost as if you're saying that we are fundamentally deformed and there is nothing of value in our past and nothing which is of good as far as we are concerned. That seems to be the approach of the Indian state. And it's not as if that's been the approach under any particular party. That's been the approach under every dispensation, because governments come and go, but bureaucracy remains. The bulk of the policy making in this country is in the hands of bureaucrats, which is why policies don't change even if governments change significantly. Particularly when it comes to identity-related aspects, the approach of bureaucrats is more or less the same, because what they're expected to subscribe to and what they're expected to learn by heart is colonial version of Bharat's history. That is the white man's perception and the white Christian man's perception of the local savage is the perception of the Indian bureaucrat, which is the same as the colonial bureaucrat. Okay. In fact, I've shown instances where the colonizer's bureaucrat has been much more sensitive to Indian traditions than the Indian bureaucrat himself. Okay? That we have become more British than the British because we act like new converts. And that's exactly the point that I tried to address, saying we wish to be more grammatically correct in English than the Englishman himself. Okay? So that is the extent of a colonial consciousness. So I've given concrete markers and references to each of these things, citing their discussions, citing the correspondence between our own historical figures, such as Raja Ram Mohan Roy and the then, let's say, Viceroy and the Governor General, as to how we were begging for European education and literally spitting on Bharatiya forms of education. I have extracted the correspondence heavily from European records and English records maintained by the Bureau of Education, which was established under the British man in 1830s and 1890s. So I've taken all those books and I've extracted significantly so that nobody can at least accuse me of getting my facts wrong. People can disagree with my conclusions, but I will not be caught on facts. I've been very, very clear about that. People can say, हम आपके नतीजे से सहमत नहीं है, ठीक है, आप मेरे नतीजे से असहमत हो सकते हैं. I don't have a problem with that. But आप facts का क्या करेंगे ये मुझे बताइए. That's all I have done.
Right, sir. So one of the most prominent words on your cover page is coloniality, and you also have especially laid stress on Middle Eastern coloniality. So frankly, this is the first time that I'm hearing it. What's the difference between it and what exactly it is?
So the first section of the book is an attempt to unpack this concept. Let me clarify this. I'm not a pioneer in this field. I'm a learner as far as this particular field is concerned. The concept of coloniality was first formulated by Latin American scholars in 1989, when they were trying to understand what was the thought process that motivated European colonialism. And therefore, they came out with the concept of coloniality to say, a specific mindset is the reason behind these actions of the colonizer, where he believes that every society is meant to be colonized and to be treated as a resource, and its people are supposed to be treated as savages and barbarians. So what informed that particular thought process? Whether it was the colonizer's religion, or was it his race, or whether his race supremacism was informed by his religious supremacism. These are aspects that I've tried to address. So whenever literature or academic literature typically speaks of coloniality, it means European coloniality or European mindset, okay? Which is to say, see, today if we say Angrez chale gaye, yahan pe brown sahib ko chhod ke chale gaye, that's the language that we typically speak of, let's say, a bureaucrat in Bharat. How are you able to say that? Because you believe that the skin complexion may have changed, but the thought process hasn't changed, okay? So that is the meaning of coloniality. The thought process is coloniality or colonial consciousness, okay? So that's the first level of response to your question. In addition to that, what I have said is, European colonization was perhaps the more systematic form of colonization that Bharat has seen. But before that, it has seen a much more aggressive form of colonization coming from the Middle East, which is known as the Middle Eastern coloniality. And I've said that the previous version of coloniality that Bharat experienced from the invasion of Sindh in the 8th century onwards until the advent of the British was a form that believed in destroying the native life completely and rooting out, or rather weeding it out root and branch, from destruction of, let's say, places of worship to places of learning to libraries to burning of libraries. The only thing that he wanted was a barren place, okay, to destroy it and to rebuild it in his own image. Now, when European came, he decided to do a slightly different thing, which is he said, if I can't convert you, I will make you a part of my society by teaching you my language, by giving you my education, by giving you my institutions, so that you remain whatever you are only on paper and your identity is a mere paper identity, but from within you are effectively an Angrez. Okay, so I have said that one was a much more open form of colonization or an aggressive form of colonization, whereas the European form of colonization was subtle, because they believed in using education as a means to completely turn you away from your roots and identity. So which is why I've said both these forms of coloniality Bharat has experienced and continues to experience in different forms. And therefore, several of your national problems or civilizational issues are a product of and a direct consequence of European colonial consciousness and Middle Eastern colonial consciousness, which continue to act against and to the detriment of native Indic consciousness. So I've clearly said that both of them are bed partners and collaborators for all practical purposes, and their common problem and the common issue that they have with is the native identity. That's what I've tried to address.
Right, sir. So do you, this is my last question, sir, before you open up to the public. So is our constitution equidistant from Magna Carta and Dharma, or it has a specific leaning towards one?
I will be able to address the question better when I start working on the sequel to the book, because that's when I'm looking at the 1950 Constitution. Okay. At this stage, I have completed only 1919, 1920, and I'm still in the process of reading the material which led to the Constitution of 1950. So I don't wish to answer that question at this stage. However, I can give you a couple of examples which show that it's a mixed bag. Okay. On the one hand, the Constitution specifically speaks of and envisages a ban on cow slaughter, which is a representation of a civilizational ethos or a civilizational sentiment. On the other hand, if you take a look at Article 25(2)(a), which speaks of, let's say, religious institutions and secular aspects of religious institutions, I've actually alluded to this. This difference between religion and secularism, or let's say the divide between the religious and the secular, is the product of Christian political theology, which was subsequently secularized during the period of Enlightenment. And every constitution, which was the product of, let's say, the First World War, has this divide between the religious and the secular. So therefore, on the face of it, Bharat's constitution is a mixed bag, at least this is my tentative opinion as on date, of both Indic principles and Western principles or Christian colonial principles. Balance किस तरफ tilt होता है अभी तक मैंने उसका I have not been able to arrive at the conclusion. I will do that when I finish the second book. But I know for a fact that there are significant provisions of the Constitution which are heavily influenced by colonial mentality.
Right, so we are taking one question from the Facebook, sir. One of the commentators has asked this question. It's Mr. Satyendra Thakur. How do we find a sweet spot between modernity and decolonization, as the Industrial Revolution had a great impact on social and political life, and its values were primarily dictated by the West?
So the question has a fundamentally problematic premise, which is that modernity has not been understood because it's being presented as a value. Therefore, he wants to strike a balance between modernity and, let's say, our own cultural values. What is the meaning of modernity and the colonial assumption of modernity is something that I've addressed heavily in the book. To say modern as a word, कब आया? Okay. And what are its assumptions? What are its connotations? Can modernity ever be divorced from Westernity? These are aspects that I've addressed. Because even scholars of the West are very clear, and scholars from the non-West are also equally clear, that modernity as we know it today cannot be divorced from Westernization, because that is how it has been pushed aggressively. Okay, so therefore, which is why even from a linguistic standpoint, several scholars are asking us to give up the use of the word modern because of its colonial assumptions. They're asking us to replace modern with contemporary. Okay. Because what you're trying to say is, how do we live at pace with the times as opposed to being stuck in the past? That's what you're trying to address. But the moment you use the word modern, it has significant historical connotations. So that is something that you have to consider. Second, to assume that Industrial Revolution has done good to the world, I'm so sorry, you have to read enough literature to see the kind of devastation it has wreaked on nature. In fact, the West itself is saying that Industrial Revolution and the manner in which it went about devaluing nature is the single biggest reason that you're staring at a global climate crisis today. Okay? And how Western colonialism, coupled with its economic thought process, is single-handedly responsible for the destruction of nature. And societies such as Indian societies and Bharatiya societies, including pre-colonial societies of Africa, pre-colonial societies of North America, the relationship that they enjoyed with nature, how it was destroyed by colonialism, is something that we are yet to understand. Your problem today in Bharat, which is the tribal issues that you face today, the displacement issues that you face today, the rehabilitation issues that you face today, are direct products of the destruction of your relationship with nature, because you have imported the same economic philosophy of the colonizer as opposed to applying your own mind to your own circumstances. In fact, I have clearly identified literature in the book to say the colonizer had a uniform approach to development in every jurisdiction, regardless of their own culture, regardless of their own environmental circumstances. Imagine how stupid that is. It is to say, if you can build 6-lane highways and 8-lane highways in Uttar Pradesh, can you hope to build 6-lane highways and 8-lane highways in Uttarakhand? Can you have that policy? What will be a consequence of that? If you want to live in Delhi as opposed to converting Uttarakhand into Delhi, because it has its own ecological balance that needs to be preserved. These are aspects that our own thought leaders and our own thinkers have actually commented upon. So civilizational consciousness is not just about religion. It's not just about caste. It has heavily to do with nature and development, which is why in the book I touch upon language, caste, tribe, development, gender, human rights to say how each of these aspects have been corrupted as a consequence of colonial consciousness. It's not limited to just education and history. It goes much, much beyond that. And the most central relationship that colonial consciousness affects is the relationship between human beings and nature. Please, these are portions of the book that I would expect students to read, because law students may or may not have an interest in this. But please read this, because tomorrow if you decide to become practitioners of environmental law, you have to think of imbibing principles of dharmic environmentalism as part of policy making, as opposed to importing a Western principle blindly. In fact, their own experience today, even including in North America, is that when it comes to environmental conservation, they hope to listen to the indigenous tribes who are less than 10% today in North America and Latin America, because they have realized that these people know much better about preserving and conserving nature than the colonizer. Okay, so even from the perspective of development or from the perspective of preserving nature, it's important to go back to your roots. But whether we can completely go back to our roots, what is the middle path? I leave you to read the book on that.
Right, so we have a question from Mr. Alok Kumar Jha, practicing advocate, sir.
Yeah.
This question is, today the narrative is being pushed that the idea of the nation state, that is India, finds its origin in colonial project. That is to say that there was no concept of India before Britishers or British consolidated the idea of India. How do you see this?
No. So in fact, my introduction addresses this specific aspect. These are the questions that I asked. That did we exist? Nation state itself is the concept of the Treaty of Westphalia of October 24, 1648. The Peace of Westphalia is significantly responsible for creating this creature called the nation state. We were a civilizational society. So therefore, to say if you were not a nation state, you did not exist, is a Western argument. And my point is, I don't need to be a nation state to exist as a civilization, because that is the Bharatiya way of philosophy. That's our philosophy of politics. That's our philosophy of political economy. So if I'm being told, just मापदंड पे आपको तोला जाएगा वो Western मापदंड है, and I'm fundamentally saying, अरे भाई, you can't do that to us. My basic question is, you can't apply a Western benchmark to decide whether I was a nation state or not. You can't, if let's go by that logic. Germany existed only after its unification of 1871 when Bismarck did it. So are you telling me that the concept of a Germanic nation did not exist before that? Of course it existed, because it existed as a cultural entity before that. All Germanic speaking states were the states or the provinces that were united by Otto von Bismarck, right? And who do we know as the Otto von Bismarck of Bharat? Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel is the one who's seen as the Otto von Bismarck of Bharat, because he created this unit, this entity after integration. Imagine, I'll ask you a simple question. If you and your neighbor tomorrow decide to build a common family and a common house, would you do that unless both of you share something in common? Values common hone chahiye, kuch to common hona chahiye, correct? And if 565 princely states come together to form a union, would they have agreed to do so unless and until there was a common identity? Think of it. They wouldn't have agreed to be a part of the Indian Union unless they believed that there was a common bond that they shared with the rest of the princely states in the larger union. It's a simple, it's a question of common sense. Surely it's not your case that all of these people chose to be a part of the Indian Union despite their cultures being completely different from the rest of the Union? Impossible. That would be a fundamentally ahistoric and stupid argument to make. Think of it. So therefore, there is a distinction between a political republic under the constitution and a civilization prior to the constitution. Okay? So as a nation state in the European mold, obviously we came into existence in 1947. But as a civilization, as Bharat and as India, as a civilizational unit, we existed for several thousand years when the white colonizer, so to speak, was walking around naked in Europe, when he was living in the Dark Ages, when he had no concept of a nation state, when he had no concept of a culture. That's recorded history. For them, it's pre-recorded history. For us, it's recorded history. So therefore, the central idea behind the book is to not look at your past through the eyes of the Western lens or through the Western lens. Look at your past through your own lens. That's the point I'm trying to make. And this question that has been asked, is one of the central questions that I raise in the first chapter of the book, and I continue to address throughout the book. Raman.
Yeah, my question to you is, can you identify one solitary, the most important reason why we were colonized in the very first place?
So, typically it is assumed that since Bharat as a society has been constantly defeated and it is meant to be ruled, that is why we were first ruled by the Arabs, and then we were ruled by Central Asians, and then we were ruled by Mongols, and then we were ruled by the Hunas, and then we were ruled by, let's say, the European colonizers. That's the understanding. No, not at all. The point is very, very simple. If you look at global history, the movement of power has gone from society to society. Okay? No society has been in power for eternity. No society has been able to rule entire humanity for its entire period. At some point, Indians had power, rather Bharatiyas had power, along with the Chinese and the Middle Kingdom. From there, it moved to Europe and then to Middle East and back to Europe now. And now we are seeing that Europe is on the decline. The West is on the decline. So the movement of power has come back to Asia. Because history is not linear, it is cyclical, because societies keep moving up and down. Okay, so there could be several local factors to say, perhaps after, let's say, centuries of constant invasion, perhaps we were tired, because there is a concept of, let's say, civilizational fatigue. There is a concept of, let's say, a weak or let's say a gene which has been constantly fighting over and over again. I'll give you a simple example, and perhaps I'll give you a local example. Anyone who comes from the south finds the north, or at least Delhi, fairly aggressive. Okay? And they typically say, "नहीं नहीं, यहाँ पे तो बहुत लड़ाकू होते हैं." Why is it? People say, "नहीं नहीं, ये ऐसे ही है." No, ऐसे नहीं है. This part of the country has faced invasions over and over and over again. Are you telling me it wouldn't have had a bearing on individual psyche? Of course it would have had, right? Because this part of the country has borne the brunt, and precisely because of that, Indian culture and Bharatiya culture is to a significant extent alive in the south. So whenever people from the south make the statement, I say, you should thank the people of the north that you are calmer and that your religion is alive and your culture is alive, because the north has paid the price for you significantly. Okay. Similarly, when you look at, let's say, global history, this is one civilization that has seen waves of invasion, but has also successfully resisted it. This is the place where Alexander has to lose and go back. This is the place which Arabs could not completely conquer. By the time the European enters this country, he is taking charge not from the Mughal, he is taking power from the Marathas significantly. Okay. So with all that going on, Europe was the power on the rise. The sun of the European civilization was rising then. One because of technology, or one because they had chosen to use trade as a means of entering a certain society, or they were much more systematic in their approach. There could be a host of factors. But remember one thing: none of these movements is ever permanent. It's impossible for anybody to hope, because at one point the British man openly said this, that the sun will never set on the British Empire. Where is Britain today? What is its size today? Can it even match any of the big powers, so to speak? It can't. So every society and civilization goes through this movement. And anybody who thinks that he will constantly remain on the top has really not understood human history, for that matter, or human psychology. So I would see that as a larger movement in history, and it's still work in progress. And if I say so, European colonization started in 1492. We are in 2021. You're effectively looking at slightly over 5 centuries. 5 centuries is nothing in human history. It's really nothing. Every 50 years or every 25 years, history changes. Who knows what will happen in the next 25 to 30 years? So I really don't believe the last 5 centuries will dictate the next half a decade also, or let's say half a century also. Otherwise, imagine the rise of China and hopefully the rise of Bharat. And I certainly see, and several, let's say, geopolitical experts who are rishis of the subjects have clearly said that the future belongs to Asia, at least the foreseeable future. So I don't subscribe to a defeatist notion. I'm a student of cyclical history. So therefore, to sum up what I had to say, history is never linear. History is cyclical, and Shakti jiske haath mein hai, and he is the one who effectively rules history. And the movement of Shakti is constant. The movement of energy is constant. So whichever society is possessed of energy is the society that holds the sway. But how long it is able to hold that particular energy, how is it able to institutionalize it, and how is it able to transmit it to its successive generations is what decides the longevity of that particular society at the top. Okay? And no civilization other than the Asian civilizations have managed to remain at the top for several millennia. That is a fact.
We have a couple of public questions, sir, before we wrap up.
Thank you, sir. First of all, I would take this opportunity to extend my hearty congratulations for writing such a brilliant book, and I hope and wish for the future endeavors too. So coming to my question now. So one of the most deeply embedded legacies of the European coloniality we see in India is that of English language. So the rise of the English language in itself has come at the cost of the Indian contemporaries. Throughout the 18th, 19th, 20th century, we see that the Indian languages have lost their grounds and English language have gained that ground particularly. And this is even more true in the present times. This is even more so true for the languages such as Sanskrit and the ancient languages on those lines. So keeping all this in context, my question is a two-parter. So first of all, what are your views regarding this status of the English language in modern Indian society? How do you see it will evolve into the future? And this is the conflict between the India and Bharat. That is the conflict between the Indian languages and the languages of the native India. That is the conflict between India and Bharat. As the second part of this question, an extension. So is it justified to speak of revival of Indian ethos and the culture when they're particularly speaking in a tongue that is completely foreign to that culture? Almost all the public platforms that we have, we speak in the language that is English, and that is not our language. That is not part of our culture. So these are two parts of my question.
So Shishir, keep your video on so that I can actually address this question. Okay. So I think in chapter 5 or chapter 6, there is a sub-chapter under the head language and education policy. So in that portion, I clearly show that the very reason that English education was introduced, because they believed that English education would lead to infusion of Christian morality in Indians, or the concept of morality itself, and the concept of Christian civilization in Indians. From British parliamentary debates also have extensively cited this, because you see WhatsApp University constantly speaks of only Macaulay and his policies of English education in India. But other than Macaulay, how many people, both Indians and non-Indians, wanted to be educated in English is something that I have specifically captured. You see, coloniality as a concept is a two-way street, which is you can blame the colonizer only to some extent. Beyond that, you must take the responsibility for continuing with colonizers' policies, for continuing with the colonizers' language policy, for continuing with the colonizers' education policy. Because the British man left this country in 1947. What has stopped you from changing his policy from 1947? So from 1947, the blame for continuing with the colonizers' language and education policies exclusively lies at the door of the Indian state. And the reason that you have not changed your policy is because while the colonizer has left, colonial consciousness has not left this country, and that is the precise diagnosis that I've undertaken in the book. Second, whenever I've had these debates on public platforms, I've had a lot of people telling me, how can we have trade in this country when people don't speak the same language? Is it your case that before the British man, people who were speaking Odia and Telugu were not talking to each other, that they were not transacting business with each other? Is this your knowledge of human history and Indian history and human psychology? Because you see, in this country, even before the British man left, inter-Bharat trade was such a flourishing activity that spices from the south and diamonds from the south and materials from the north would frequently be exchanged. Were we speaking in English for us to undertake all this activity? So that's one. Second, if you were to treat Bharat as an equivalent of a Japan or an Israel or any particular European nation, you will always make a mistake as far as language policy is concerned, because Bharat is a Europe in itself because of multiplicity of languages. So therefore, in the formulation of your language policy, you must look at not a country which has one predominant language, but a continent such as Europe, which is trying to operate as a single political unit like the EU, despite having multiple languages. And on this aspect, I'm sure a lot of people have heard this gentleman, Sankrant Sanu, who has written quite a few things on Bhasha Niti and so on and so forth. So I am completely in sync with your question and the spirit of your question, that you can't speak of Bharatiya ethos and Indic ethos while continuing to speak in English. And in fact, in the introduction of my book, I clearly say that I was severely handicapped in terms of my own literature survey because I couldn't read in any language fluently outside of English. And the only other language that I can get myself to read significantly is Hindi and Telugu, not even my own mother tongue Tamil. Okay? So I have tried to say that as long as we continue relegating Indian languages to an ornamental status, and we don't mainstream it either for the purposes of education or for business or transaction, it will continue to be obscured and it will continue to lose value. And at best, it will be relegated to the realm of literature, but not to day-to-day transactions. That is why I have severely criticized the recent policy of the state government of Andhra Pradesh of abolishing Telugu medium schools. If you stop people from learning in their own mother tongues and you believe that English education is the only way of going about it, then you're only reinforcing the colonizer's position that the only way you will think and the only language in which you will operate is my language. Language is not just a medium of communication. It is a carrier of culture. It is a transmitter of culture. It is a transmitter of the past. So if you choose to sever your roots with language, you are severing your roots with your culture. And therefore, my book will be translated in Indian languages. That is the primary reason that I first wrote in English, so that I express myself with clarity, because unfortunately, I am best expressed in English. Not fortunately, unfortunately. And therefore, the next book or the next language it will be translated in is at least 3 languages: Telugu, Tamil and Hindi. And because the book has met with fair commercial success, there is enough incentive on the part of the publisher to translate this. I'm already in talks on the translation significantly. So I hope that the book will go beyond English, because even from a commercial standpoint, more people understand Indian languages than English in this country. And I think therefore there is enough reason to do the translation. So I don't disagree with your question at all. You've hit the nail on the head. And you will find significant answers of both the cause and the effect in the book. So please do read the book on this aspect. I've tried to cover all these aspects.
Our dharmic structure is quite deep to guide us with what our way of life should be. But our constitution, which has great colonial imprints, tells us what our rights and duties are, with a disproportionate emphasis on the rights. So isn't it unfortunate that our ancient knowledge has been kept aside and a book so disconnected to our roots now being revered? And isn't it a challenge for our future generations, which would eventually grow up on the constitution being taught to them and they losing their cultural connect? So what should be our roadmap now to undo these subtle colonial hangovers that we have now?
See, the one thing that has happened as a consequence of extensive rights-based discourse is that the entire world is realizing, अगर आप सिर्फ अधिकारों की बात करेंगे तो दायित्व और कर्तव्य की बात कौन करेगा? Okay, so there is a global realization that's coming about now. Okay, so I believe that this global realization will gradually lead to a duty-based discourse. And now, since India unfortunately continues to be a mental slave, क्योंकि सारा विश्व अगर एक डायरेक्शन में जाएगा तो हम भी उसी डायरेक्शन में जाएंगे. So it's not because of our own realization and our own originality, but because the rest of the world is doing this, हम भी यही करेंगे. So problem ये है, पाश्चात्य जगत जो कुछ भी करेगा, सही करेगा या गलत करेगा, हम उसको follow करेंगे. So tomorrow we will realize the value of a duty-based discourse and our own traditions only because the Western man is going to tell us. That's precisely what Swami Vivekananda said, that tomorrow you'll realize the value of your own scripture and your philosophy because the West is going to realize the value before you. And when they start stealing stuff and appropriating stuff and calling it, now you have beer yoga, power yoga, steam yoga, whatever yoga, then you'll start realizing, हमसे चुराया और आप इसको कितना corrupt किए जा रहे हैं, then you'll start realizing the value of it. Okay? So it is unfortunate that we have come to a point where we see value in our culture when the outsider sees value in our culture. But I hope that at least in my generation, we will start looking at our past with a greater sense of respect. I repeat, I have a lot of people on social media end up saying, he seems like someone who is going to sit and justify the caste system. He seems like someone who is going to sit and justify the dowry system. He seems like someone who's going to sit and justify the sati system. Are these your arguments against my position? If that is your argument against my position, one, you refuse to listen to what I have to say because you're approaching me with a preconceived notion. Second, in not a single talk of mine can anybody accuse me of supporting anything that is regressive. Okay? But it is certainly my case. जब आप जाति की बात करते हैं या वर्ण प्रथा की बात करते हैं या सती प्रथा की बात करते हैं, understand it from the perspective of your historians. Don't rely on the Englishman's representation of your culture. And as long as you are able to come to the conclusion that I disagree with it, even after reading our own version, I don't have a problem. But if you're going to disagree with it based on someone else's representation, then you're turning a blind eye to the motivations of that particular person. Okay? So in this regard, I have given the example of sati in the book, citing Dr. Meenakshi Jain's work, as well as other literature to say, sati was criticized by two groups of people when it was abolished. One group was the Tagore family, and the other were those who were supporting the English reformers. Okay? Tagore family said, first of all, sati is not that prevalent, and two, it is not mandatory. Three, please do not vilify the Hindu system citing sati. You can separate the two. Okay? On the other hand, the sati was used as a whipping stick, or let's say as a whipping boy, to effectively misrepresent and mischaracterize Hinduism. Okay? The other example that I've given is how the Jagannath Yatra was used to malign Hinduism. I have cited the works of English missionaries, such as James Buchanan. Okay, I think James Buchanan or some other Buchanan, sorry. That gentleman is the reason why you represent Jagannath as Juggernaut. He was the one to corrupt that word to Juggernaut. Okay. He used to write letters to his followers in England saying, भारत में औरतों को जलाया जाता है, यहाँ पे देवदासी का प्रथा होता है, which is effectively, he effectively called it temple prostitution. Okay. Then he said, the society here is so barbaric that people are thrown under the wheels of the juggernaut to kill them. Okay. All these letters were written for what? To collect money, saying यहाँ पे लोगों को बचाना है क्योंकि ये अनपढ़ गवार और एक नंबर के savages हैं. So please send me money to convert them. So that is the version of history that our students keep talking about Bharat. So इनका discussion जो है भारत के बारे में सिर्फ तीन चीजों पे रुक जाता है: जाति, सती, डाउरी. डाउरी, सती, जाति. इससे ज्यादा और इसके ऊपर इनको कुछ समझ में भी नहीं आता और जानते भी नहीं, और इसके बारे में भी ठीक से नहीं जानते. Okay. So therefore I have tried to address these central questions to say, you are able to mouth and parrot this nonsense simply because you are consuming the Western man's version of your history. You haven't read your own history. आपके पास ना primary source है ना कुछ है. If you don't understand either your own mother tongues or you don't understand Sanskrit, which primary resource have you looked at to arrive at these conclusions? अगर आपको ये भाषाएं समझ में भी नहीं आती हैं और आप उनका अनुवाद नहीं कर सकते हैं, on what basis did you come to this conclusion? Because the only book that you have read is in English. Who has written this? The person who has come and invaded you. Are you really telling me that he really is going to be, let's say, benign in the manner in which he represents your culture? I don't think so. I certainly don't think so. So I'm happy that you have asked this question. Let us hope that we don't learn from the West about our value and we develop our own originality. क्योंकि आज हम विश्व गुरु, इस गुरु, उस गुरु की बात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन अगर आपको अपने आप में विश्वास नहीं है एंड आप खुद के लिए गुरु बनने के लिए तैयार नहीं है, आप विश्व के गुरु कहां से बनेंगे? Okay, why will the world listen to a community or a civilization which is unwilling to live by its own values and has no faith in its own values? Why will they listen to you? They have no reason to listen to you because you're not even the original thought leader, so to speak. I hope I've answered the question.
So thank you so much for your session. So I understand your time, your schedule. I know what's it worth. Request Kajal Sonkar to deliver a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you, sir, for such articulate and insightful answers. And thank you for taking out your time for addressing all our questions. And I'm sure each one of us has gained a unique viewpoint with reference to the topic. I would also like to thank Vijay for conducting such an engaging question and answer session, and especially Raman sir for participating in this session and for being our constant support system. I would also like to thank Dr. Seema Singh for her never-ending support and guidance that she has presented us with. And also I would like to thank the team of DDS for putting up this event. And again, lastly, obviously, I mean, thanks a lot, sir, for joining us. And a student as a political science myself, and for a student of law, that it was so important that we would need a book like this. And thank you so much, sir.
So first of all, I'm grateful to the organizers once more. So I have two announcements to make. One is there is going to be a book reading and book signing session for students of Delhi in multiple sessions. And since DU has not opened your campuses yet, a couple of other organizations are going to organize these sessions. So you're welcome to actually attend those sessions. And there will be detailed discussions. There will be a proper book reading where specific extracts from the book will be read. Those extracts, which I believe is where I've packed my punch, okay, hoping that it will create an impact. So those sessions will be there. I will send an information, and I would request you to, your students to participate. And please try and critique the book. I don't have a problem, but read it, have discussions in your campuses, and ask yourself how many positions on issues of national interest are affected by colonial consciousness. That is the first question that you should ask. This book is not meant to make saviors out of everyone, because I don't think anybody can save anybody. First thing is you have to save yourself. So, जब भी आप कोई सवाल करते हैं भारत के किसी भी प्रथा के बारे में, चाहे वो मंदिर की बात हो या जाति की बात हो, the first question that you should ask is, what is the source of my information? What am I basing my opinion on? As the lawyer, or let's say as a lawyers in training, what will your first question be? जब आप research करते हैं, सवाल क्या करेंगे? Primary material क्या है? ये secondary proposition है या primary material है? Okay? If it's a secondary proposition, ये किसने लिखा है? लिखने के पीछे उसका मकसद क्या था? The day people start asking these questions, that is when I believe that the book would effectively done its job, so that each of us can improve in our own individual journeys whenever we speak of Bharatiya Sanskriti and Bharatiya Sabhyata. So with that limited, let's say, suggestion and the announcement that there will be book reading and signing sessions, and students of DU CLC are more than welcome, I take your leave, and I'm grateful for the session. Thank you, Ramanji, and thank you, Seema ma'am, and Vijay and Kajal for your fantastic organization and for giving me an opportunity to interact with your students. Thank you.
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद साई जी, बहुत अच्छा लगा आपको सुनकर, आपसे इंटरेक्ट करके. थैंक यू वेरी मच, एंड वी लुक फॉरवर्ड टू मोर सच सेशंस. थैंक यू, धन्यवाद.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.